To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast, a place of learning for those who aspire to leadership excellence. Here's our host, Mike Etor.
Brittinay Lenhart is the founder of Work Culture Consultant, LLC. She guides company executives to elevate psychological safety for employees through highly customized emotional intelligence coaching. Starting with a step-by-step culture analysis, Brittinay supports executives through the process of evaluating the environment of their workplace so they can identify which elements of their culture aren't working and reprogram outdated systems. She then helps leadership teams strategically humanize their internal processes, empowering them to restructure and rebrand their culture so that employees can flourish at work and executives can continue to gain and retain the best talent. I follow Brittinay on LinkedIn, always enjoy reading your insightful posts and lessons. Brittinay, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Fidelis Leadership Podcast.
Thank you. I'm honored.
The pleasure's all mine. You're putting up some good posts lately. I saw the one about servant leadership and the anonymous survey thing today. I mean, spot on. So I'm thinking, this person actually got some experience out there. She knows what she's talking about. So that said, listen, the intro was good. It's not really that complete. So give us a little bit more. Give us another 90 seconds or so. What more does the audience need to know about Brittinay?
So I was in the Air Force for 8 years. I joined at 17 and, had a lengthy 8 years, felt like probably 20 compacted. I started off as a jet engine mechanic, but then cross-trained to be the Secretary of Defense's flight crew, which I loved. But then I got out and all my degrees and things that I study are, organizational management, leadership. So me and you have that in common. We love just eat this stuff up. But long story short, I had, when I was in the military, I dealt with people that were in leadership positions that were not leaders. Great lessons to learn there. But I have a lot of experience, in the blue collar space and then the white collar space in, if you're in a toxic work environment, productivity is crap. And then if you're in a, great leadership and a good culture, productivity is high. So it's very basic, but so many people get it wrong. And so long story short, there was what I felt was a need in the market for what I do. And I made it up and here we are.
Hold that thought. I'm going to go right to that. But first, where were you raised and where do you live now?
I was raised in Arizona as you see here, in this podunk town of 1,300 people called Topak. But now I am based out of Washington State.
Where in Washington State?
Lacey, which is south of Seattle.
Okay. As a young enlisted Marine, I was stationed at what is now the submarine base at Bangor.
Oh, okay.
It was very tiny then, and then they started. It's huge now for nuclear subs and all that. When I was there was the old diesel boats with Polaris missiles. It was beautiful country though. Rained in the winter though. I remember that it was always misty in the winter. But Seattle itself was beautiful. I loved the area. Really, really did. So back to you and your business. I always ask people so that up front people understand who we're talking to. So I've read the intro, Brittinay. What does your business literally do for companies? Who are your clients? What do you do for them?
My clients are founders and or C-suite. And I only really deal with them for the most part because of culture is a top-down situation. If there's not buy-in at the top, culture isn't gonna work if the top isn't bought in. So that's why I deal with C-suite. But what I help them do is gain emotionally intelligent work cultures, which helps maintain or make a healthy work culture, which again higher productivity at your people. When people feel like they have a psychologically safe place to work, they want to come to work. They don't hate it. You get more productivity out of them. So employee engagement goes up, and we gain and retain top talent, stealing from their competitors because we have, we're creating a culture that people run to and not away from.
Yeah, I love it. Well, listen, if you were limited to 2 or 3 sentences to explain Brittinay's philosophy on leadership, and that's a whole lot to compress into 2 or 3 sentences,
Mm-hmm.
how would you answer that question?
People like to pontificate a lot about their style and their, what they are. But at the end of the day, leadership is just influence. And no matter what box you put yourself in, at the end of the day, it's how you make people feel and how effective you are at making something happen. I feel like it's, super simple, and just, if you're going to talk about it, be about it. So it's all about action. It's not about whatever you post on LinkedIn. It's about what you actually do.
Yes, I actually have a statement that I make, and it's in my book. I tell people that to support what you say, I feel the same way, that leadership is not something you do, it's who you are. It's who you are, And I saw your post on servant leadership. I am a fan of servant leadership. That said, I think, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I think no matter what a person says their style is, my experience is most of the very best and very most effective leaders are pretty much all doing the same thing.
Yes.
It's human nature. It's dealing with human beings and collectively harnessing, their collective energies and aiming it toward a goal and an end state. Thoughts?
100%. It's that. I mean, you're the leadership guru, friend. So I completely agree, though. And everyone's doing the same thing. And I'm not necessarily against servant leadership. I'm just tired of that being the buzzword that people want to cling to. When leadership, it just is, or it is not.
Right. Well, in my book, and by the way, I'll send you copies when we end. Well, if you give me your address, I specifically mentioned that in one of the chapters. I never heard the term servant leadership throughout my whole time in the Marine Corps. And it was invented, I want to say, in the 50s by a guy named Robert Greenleaf. He was a leadership guru of the day. That said, we have a famous general named John A. Lejeune in the 19-teens and early 20s that really codified our leadership philosophy for the Marine Corps. And they still read his documents today. And everything he was saying was servant leadership. So before the term was invented, I think it was just called good leadership.
Right.
So we were practicing the Marine Corps, Air Force, Army, Air Corps, whatever. A whole lot of organizations were practicing servant leadership well before the term ever got coined and became fashionable. So I understand the sentiment of what you're saying, and I applaud that entirely. Seems like almost every day there's somebody on LinkedIn or somewhere else with a new leadership. Well, here's the leadership for this century, and I'm like, okay, so I'll read it. I'm like, it's for the last 15 centuries. There's nothing new there,
Right. It's the same thing. You're just putting a fancy name on it because Simon Sinek said it.
Yeah.
And don't get me started, but
yeah, I hear you. I get it. Well, listen, I always start off one of the earliest question I really ask is the timeless question: leaders, born or made?
People don't like my the big man theory, but I kind of agree with it that to a point, we are absolutely born with the innate trait, or we are not. There are some people who are just betas.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how much you completely throw leadership training at them. People just have it or they don't. And so that's why I do feel like there's some, and don't get me wrong, there are people who are born with it that don't realize how good they could be. So they need that mentorship to become the best leader that they can be. But there are some people that just will never be leaders, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, so my spin on that is, I think there are some, the big man theory, I think there are some natural leaders. I think there are other people that are born, they just have more aptitude for leadership. They can learn it and get better, much like sports, music, math, or whatever.
Right.
Just about everybody on this earth can be better at math, music, and a whole lot than Mike Etor. There's a lot of talent I don't have.
Same.
And then to your point, there are some people that, for lack of a better, God just took that chip out of the motherboard, and they don't want to be leaders first and foremost.
Right.
And they don't exhibit good leadership. The tragedy is when you get someone like that in a leadership role.
Yeah.
Now we got big problems,
That's why I'm more about like horizontal organizations instead of the normal, because if we have tech tracks for, I'm just kind of overarching here, then people that want to still make more money but not be in leadership positions, that's the best place to put those situations. Instead of putting those people in leadership positions, and then all goes to heck in a handbasket.
Yeah, I agree with that. And as you know, from your military experience, all the services are the same. They all have an up or out, culture, mentality on promotion. And I have hired a lot of former Marines, especially, and I've had to tell them, look, here, if somebody wants to be the equivalent of a sergeant in the IT group, and that's all he or she ever wants to do, you let them stay there. You let them stay. Don't ever force, ask them if they want to lead, and they have to understand that at some point they're going to top out compensation wise. But yes, you really do want that guy writing code. That's all he wants to do. Doesn't want to be in charge of the guys to the right or left, but he wants to write code. That's all he wants to do for 30 years. Don't chase that guy away by putting him in a leadership role.
Right. And like, we can do other things like, spot awards, spot raises or things like that to keep them retained. We can do things to retain them without having to put them in these leadership positions. Like, there's so many other avenues, but a lot of people are just either ignorant to knowing what those avenues are, or they're lazy.
Yeah. Yes, I agree. Well, listen, we talked a little bit, we communicated a bit, and we've talked about a topic called adaptive leadership, which is near and dear to your heart. And so I'm not sure I know what it is, and I'm not sure our audience, which is all people that want to excel one way or the other as a leader. So tell us what adaptive leadership is and what are its core tenets or principles.
So I kind of, made that up, for lack of better terms, because I don't have anything specific, because me and you were talking about leadership is leadership one way or the other. But this kind of comes from full range leadership, which is actually, I learned from the Air Force, which is Scott McCullough. People can look that up. And it just talks about pretty much being adaptable, because there's various definitions of leadership, like, laissez-faire, transactional, transformational.
Right. Yeah.
And my thing with being adaptive is you have to adapt within these three realms, because not everyone is receptive to the same type of style.
Right. Yeah, I love that. I know exactly what you're talking about now. When I teach leadership styles, I actually have a graphic that shows the various styles, laissez-faire, and all of that. And I have a dial, like a stereo dial, that says, depending on the person and the audience and the environment, you've got to turn that dial and flip a few letters and know when to go back and forth for the same person and between other people. So am I capturing the concept correctly?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Well, listen, what can you say relative, now that I know what you're talking about, what advice would you give somebody, a leader that says, I need to get better at this? I'm understanding, I think what Brittinay's saying, there's no cookie cutter style that works effectively for every single person in every environment. What advice would you give a leader on maintaining flexibility with that dial from one style to another?
I think that's where like emotional intelligence comes into play. You have to have this self-awareness that, just like a love language, if people have read that book, The 5 Love Languages, there's also like business love languages. And you have to know your people well enough to know what works for them or not. But you have to, lead by walking around. You got to have these conversations with your people to know what works for them. And usually, when you do initial feedbacks, that's a great time to figure out how your employee is going to be receptive to your leadership, what works, what doesn't work, what they need from you, which is that 360-degree leadership situation that we all know. So we have to know that first. So but the emotional intelligence piece comes into play where you have to drop your ego enough to realize that you might not be good, say, at the laissez-faire piece. You're more of a transformational person. You want to be all up in people's cookies. Well, someone like me as an employee, I don't want you in my cookies. I need a laissez-faire type leader because I lead myself and just be there for me when I need it. But a leader in this, transformational space has to drop their ego enough to work with someone like me and not take it personally that that's how I need to be led.
Yeah, I like that. Do you think that is there an equal need for this kind of flexibility between styles at every level, entry level through senior executive?
I believe so, just because, I've started from the bottom, now we're here, as an airman, I felt this way. And then working with C-suite now, there's still, CFOs or COOs who, report to the CEO, and they still need that same exact flexibility.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, I throw my hypothesis on this. In my experience, the people who try and lead everyone the same way are you're on the bell curve, either you're newer leaders or you're really senior experienced leaders. The new leaders don't really know any better. They just, I'm going to lead everybody, and they haven't learned the lesson yet that these are not cookies that fit in one cutter. The senior folks, in my experience, are like, hey, I'm excited. I'm here. I must be good. And this is how I lead. It's very hard to crack into that guy's skull and tell him, even within your executive team, not everybody responds to the same level of leadership, supervision, delegation, and all that. Any thoughts?
Oh, I completely concur. Some of these C-suite I've worked with, they have different business love languages. And if their boss doesn't if they do not have those crucial conversations to figure out what those needs are, then they're going to have problems. But I can absolutely see what you're saying, where like senior people, they're like, well, I've been doing it this way, so it must work. And that's like one of the, the worst quotes of all time, the most dangerous business quotes of all time, because we've always done it that way. Well,
oh yeah. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, I have no small amount of experiences where someone's contacted me and they're looking for training for their leadership team. And when I mention that we should start with the executives, sometimes I get cool responses. There are times when the CEO says, yeah, the executives will come, but the senior guy, the CEO, doesn't feel he needs it. So he doesn't come. And so I try to tell him that probably don't need it, but you really do need to come and lead by example. And those that do, where this is going. Those that do pretty quickly take me aside and say, Mike, I'm so sorry. I need this more than anybody here. I never thought I'd learn this much, but I'm learning. And thank God you talked me into attending,
Right.
But there are some that just won't come. And training is good, but training without the top people being brought onto one sheet of music, so to speak,
Right.
less than good. Any thoughts?
I totally agree. Like when I've done my emotional intelligence training, because it's for leaders as well. It's not just people. Everyone needs to be emotionally intelligent, and emotionally intelligent leaders are the best type of leaders. But when I've had the CEOs come into these trainings, people are in the beginning that might be less apt to talk. But when the CEO starts giving his examples of certain things, then people get more like, oh man, then they get more into it. And like you said, it's leading by example. Don't ever think that you're too good, just like onboarding. When C-suite thinks they're too good to go through the normal onboarding of everyone else, what is wrong with you? You need to do this because one, just from a risk mitigation standpoint, you're going to see what is working within your own company's onboarding or not that you can help. So why it's like this elitism that needs to stop.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. I know that your profile on LinkedIn, which I scoured, literally says, and I'm reading this, Brittinay, creating work cultures people run to, not away from. I love the statement. And I was going to ask it. So can you elaborate on that? I love the statement. I might steal it too and attribute it to you, but I love it. So how do you do that?
We all know that there's just places out there that people quit because the culture and or leadership, the lack of leadership, is bad. So what you can do as a company is have that culture, have that leadership within, that everyone hears about, that people want to run to. People are sick of working at places that are toxic or just not good for them. They want to run to a place. So the best thing you can do is have a company that people run to. That's how you steal competitors' talent.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll give you a little anecdote. I worked for a billion with a billion plus company for about 15 years, and I was one of the C-level executives. And if I heard it once, I heard it 15 times over the years. I was interviewing somebody, and they would come up in my office on the 4th floor, and they had just waited in the lobby. And so in the lobby, they saw people coming and going, lunch, whatever. I can't tell you how many times, Brittinay, someone said, I got to tell you, Mike, I've never seen anything like this. I'm sitting back and I'm like, let me observe this culture. He said, I have never seen a company where so many people were smiling, walking back and forth, obviously having a good time, obviously with friends and having a good time. And the first few times I was like, okay, then I realized, wow, this is a rarity. And I told people that, the executives and all of that, as a sign, we're doing something right. And the other leaders doing something right. And it really was. It was an enjoyable place to work. And I'm sure there were odd individuals that say, I actually suck to work there. But you get my point. We had very low voluntary attrition because, to your point, people can vote with their feet.
Right.
And they will.
Right.
And they will. As you know, the surveys show that it's almost never about money. It's always about their immediate supervisor and or the culture they have to work in every day. And so sometimes there's a culture where you can't pay a person enough. You're willing to throw money, but they're like, I'll go work for $20K less just to be in a sane environment. Any thoughts on that?
100%. It's these surveys that I've done from multiple industries. It's the same thing. It's usually not about money. Of course, everyone's going to be like, oh, of course I want to get paid more. But it's not about that. It's about, like you said, the management team, if they want to run away from them because they can't stand them, that's usually the case. Or, sometimes it's better benefits is usually on the smaller end of things. Those are like the benefits and the salary are usually on the low end of the spectrum of the issues that people feel that are thing. And it's communication, if they had better communication, and that's, we know how important communication is, and great leaders have effective communication.
Yeah, this is an off-the-cuff, unscripted question. In your experience, are there any differences why a person would stay or leave a company based upon their generation? Gen X, millennials, boomers are almost all gone now, but any thoughts? Because as I understand it, and my experience has been, what's important to a 25-year-old is distinctly different than when I was 25, and it's a lot different than even a 45-year-old today. Any thoughts?
The newer generations are more value-based. They want to work at a company that they align with their values, whereas the baby boomer generation is more so like, as long as I have a pension and I can go do the same thing over and over again, I'm fine. But the reality is the newer generations don't have that luxury of a pension. Pensions aren't a thing anymore.
Right.
And it's funny because the older generations get mad at the newer ones because of this. Oh, you're job hoppers, you're this or that. Well, they have nothing to hold to because there are no more pensions.
Right. I agree with that. So I'm a boomer. And I was raised by parents that grew up in the Great Depression. And so when they grew up, companies did not have pensions. They did not have benefits. And then post World War II, people started saying, to retain people, we're going to start giving medical benefits and pensions. And that stayed in place for decades, to where my dad worked for the government at 35 years or so, retires, gets the gold watch. And the thought was, from the Depression era grandparents and all that, you get a good job, you stay there for life. Back then, if a guy in my dad's generation, if he had more than 3 jobs in his life, that was something shameful. You never admitted that.
Right.
And then as I got older and into the workforce, and as I retired from the Marine Corps, that's when pensions started going away and the 401k was transportable, which was good for the worker. It empowered the employee, because they didn't have to leave the pension. In the old days, if you left company A, your pension was done. You had to start over. So they had you handcuffed. And so I love the fact that it's there. And I also love the fact that it theoretically, and I think literally, has caused leadership teams to have to get better. Because to your point, they can pick up and go and take their 401k with them. Any thoughts?
Absolutely. And that's what I think is scaring people, is because they're coming to this realization now that if we don't do something better in this leadership realm, we're going to keep losing people. They can't hide from it anymore, because it's too much of a bleeding out artery problem.
Yeah. Well, you can't hide anymore. You have all sorts of websites called Glassdoor and things like that. And so I maintain, the executives are in charge of setting the tone from the top, culture-wise and all that. But whatever that culture is or is not, despite what's on the wall, the words on the wall, it will get out. And the people that are going to tell others what your culture really is are not executives, and they're not even leaders for the most part. There are your workers, for lack of a better way of saying it, who have direct access to public communications. Exactly. So if it's a good one, and your employee and you have 400 employees, if it's a good one, you've got 400 recruiters. If it's a bad one, you probably got about 310 anti-recruiters. Like, look, dude, don't come here.
Right. And I've literally been that person. I was in a very toxic company at one point, with the CEO was a narcissistic, crazy person. That company doesn't exist anymore. Go figure. But I literally was that person that when I saw someone come in because a lot of us were on our way out. We were just waiting to find our new job. And I told that person, I literally signaled to them, don't do it. And guess what? He came anyway. And then within weeks, he was like, I should have listened to you. I can't believe I lose my entire family here. I'm like, I tried. So it's real. We are out there, whether it's, oh, you shouldn't have done that. No, I was literally trying to save his entire family from moving to Vegas.
Yeah. Well, listen, while we're on the I've seen that shamefully too. I've seen people move their company family cross country, and realize, I knew a guy that knew that the first week he was at work, he made a grave mistake. And I saw a guy move all the way from Texas to Florida for another company, realized pretty quickly his boss was toxic, and they moved back to within a year, gone, just gone. So on the topic of cultures, and assuming that leaders really do want to have a good culture, what generic advice do you have for leaders at every level? What can they do to establish and maintain the culture that will attract and not have people run from?
I'm happy to go down this rabbit hole, because when I work with startups, I have like this MVV, which is Mission, Vision, Values workshop that I do. And that is your foundation, your mission, your vision, your values. And it is a way to hold people accountable to your culture, because the values are what we have, that if we don't have those, you can't make the mission happen, which is the battles. And we're going, military here. And then without winning those battles, you can't win the war, which is the vision. And so that's why I find it, it can be just floof on a wall, like you were saying earlier, the values, the vision, everything. That can just be nothingness, or it can be very impactful. You can use these things to make strategic decisions, and leadership can use it as an accountability tool in a positive way to ensure that we're gaining and retaining the correct talent.
Yeah. Well said. where do you see it? If you had the list on one hand, how people screw this up, what do they do wrong? How do they create cultures that cause people to run away?
Oh man. Sadly, narcissism usually some of the biggest, and I don't use that word lightly. I know very much what it is. But if you have people, because I don't call everyone a leader. You might be a person within a leadership position, but it does not make you a leader. So when people are like, oh, toxic leadership, I don't believe that at all. No, there's no toxic leadership. There are toxic managers within leadership positions, because leaders are great. That's my take on it. But what makes for these toxic environments that are not psychologically safe for anybody are people, these toxic type people that get in these leadership roles that just drain the soul out of the entire organization. It's usually just it's literally people.
If you were to ask me that question, I would say, well, let me be a little bit of a smart ass and tell you what front I would tell, that your people, if you want a good culture, they have to be able to pass the Sunday afternoon test.
Yes.
And Sunday, you know what it is? The Sunday afternoon test is when that person says, well, what a great weekend. And it's like, I get to go back there tomorrow, or
oh gosh,
I have to go back there tomorrow.
Right.
And of course, and which you know where I'm leaning on this. If the people can't wait, they're fired up. Even the person in the mailroom is fired up. I love my family. I get to go start all over on Monday because I love who I work with. It's just, can't believe they're paying me for this. I have so much fun there.
Right.
The Sunday afternoon test is a very thought-provoking exercise. And my experience, I'm going to let you talk now. My experience is a lot of senior leaders assume that everybody's passing the Sunday afternoon test. And to your thing on LinkedIn today, your article about honesty and all that, if they could plug into people's minds and see what they really thought on a Sunday afternoon about returning to their environment, their culture, I think that would be enlightening for a lot of senior leadership in a lot of companies. Any thoughts?
100%. That's why I was freaking out in my seat, because I love that reference so much. And I definitely use it as well, because it is so true. And like, I even would caveat that people don't necessarily have to love coming into work, but as long as they do not hate it and they don't have angst towards it, we're getting somewhere. Because the reality is, like, I would say there's only, a percentage that absolutely love it. And there's always going to be the smaller percent that hate it if it is a good culture. And then there's people who just kind of don't care, because they just like, I'm really just coming here to put bread on the table. And as long as y'all don't make my lives hell, I'm fine, and that's totally okay, because the majority of people are in this bell curve, like the biggest part of your company. So again, that Sunday thing still matters, because once you start getting people in where everyone is hating Sundays, you have a really big problem.
I absolutely agree with that. I want to share some thoughts on you. I was listening to a podcast one time. I don't know how I got on it, but it was a famous relationship coach, PhD, named Esther Perel. Esther and Perel, Perel. Take a listen, you'll love her. And she specializes in helping couples get together after there's infidelity.
Oh, I think
and she said, so I was listening, I was walking, I'm like, I got into it, like, what the hell? I hit the wrong podcast, and she's on there, I'm listening to it. And so it was very interesting. So I listened to it, and she said, a marriage can survive just about anything, including infidelity. It's tough, but it can happen. She said, unless one thing happens on the part of one of the partners, and that one thing is contempt. Once one of the partner, her husband cheated, she's pissed or hurt or angry. If that woman or that man develops sheer contempt for the other person, there's no going back. And I learned from that. I said, wow, that's right. That's human nature, because I'm all about human nature and leadership. And I say, once someone finds out that their boss or a coworker has contempt for them, that relationship can never be repaired, or it will never prosper.
Nope.
Getting back to what we're talking about, once an employee, once a teammate at any level develops contempt for the organization, I don't care how much you pay them, how much time off, how many espresso machines that you put in. If they have contempt for the environment they're working in, they're either going to leave or they're going to stay and themselves become kind of poisonous and toxic to the environment, because someone that hates where they're at, is usually not a happy camper, and that infects usually laterally. Any thoughts?
Yes. I'm like deep in a rabbit hole in my head while you're talking about this. It's absolutely true. The moment, even in peer-to-peer relationships within a business, if one of them has pure contempt for the other person, like, you better figure out how to move them, or one of them needs to go, because it will start to infect the entire organization.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have faced that personally at the executive level. And I'm sure you have faced it well. I have faced a couple times early in my executive career where a colleague, and I say that term loosely, a colleague really didn't think highly of me simply because of my military background. He was of the impression, he heard somewhere, that anyone that had anything going for them, why would they join the military? And so that's how he approached me. And I realized, and I realized at some point that I would never be seen by him as a professional. And so, you know what I did? I didn't sabotage him, but I stopped trying to be a partner with him. And so it wasn't a good feeling when the guy didn't even know me, and he didn't have contempt for me. He had no regard for my ability. What's the boss see in this guy? I mean, sure, I'm a patriotic guy, Marine. I respect the service, but he doesn't belong here. Truth be known, and I'm just saying this editorial statement, at some point in my maturation as an executive, I ran circles around that guy as an executive leader. And so I say that as an editorial statement because, boy, it really sucked. It really sucked to know that somebody didn't care for me and had low regard for me over something I couldn't control.
Right.
And I certainly wasn't going to quit, but of course I was in a different position than the Lance Corporal, so to speak, that was down several levels and all that, had a mortgage, a new baby, and, had to stay for a while and all of that. So anyway, let's switch gears. I know you have a lot of experience teaching and coaching on the topic of emotional intelligence. On the hunch that some of our listeners don't know what emotional intelligence is, give us your definition of it and some main points that people can think about and focus personally and then as leaders.
So emotional intelligence, long story short, is the way we're able to adapt our communication. And then they're like, okay, there's got to be more to it. Yes. And here you can either be offended all the time and then you have low EQ, or you can be offensive all the time and have low EQ. So there's got to be some balance. You can't be offended about everything, because you have to have emotional intelligence enough to know that, like, maybe that person, even though how they're saying it, I don't like, the message behind it is probably, it's trying to assume positive intent. And then you're having less personnel issues here. And then from the other side, the carrier of the message, you have to have enough emotional intelligence to know that if you want your end goal to be this, you have to be effective enough in your communication to tailor it in a way that the other person is going to be receptive to the message. So it's just all about being receptive and communicating properly. And that's really emotional intelligence, because this goes from relationships at home to peer or boss communications at work.
Yeah, I love that. I want to go one level deeper on it when it comes to communications. What I've learned, sometimes the hard way, is the thought and message that I transmitted isn't necessarily received in the manner that I wanted it. I'm going to give you an example. I grew up, the Northeast and all of that, and slang. And one of the highest compliments I could give a woman was, man, I like her, smart girl, really smart girl. And so I used to say that until a woman took me aside and said, Mike, look, I know it's innocent. I just want to school you up a little bit. Some people that are 30s, 40s, 50s are going to be flattered that you call them a girl because it's an age thing. Others are going to be insulted, like, I am a mature professional woman. And she said, I just want you to be aware of it. I'm not telling you to change, because I know you're saying it. Every time you say it, you're really praising somebody. Clearly, you think highly of this woman. I just want you to be aware. And I'm like, ooh, okay. And so I still say that, but more often than not, I say, no, I like her a lot. That's one smart lady.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't run into anyone that has a problem with being called a lady. Right. So that's just an example of me personally. I meant no harm. Right. I was transmitting a good message, but she was telling me some people, to your point, that are constantly offended, they're going to latch on that and say, oh, of course, we got a brain sexist, blah, 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 blah. And next thing you know, I'm accused of demeaning women or whatever the case may be. Uh-huh. And if I was accused of that, I would have said no, and then I would have been tiptoeing around, and that's no place to work. Any thoughts? I've said a lot, but
no, that's a perfect example on both sides of the spectrum of emotional intelligence, because one, she wasn't offended, but she was aware that someone else may be, and she you in a respectful way that you were receptive to. And on the other side of the spectrum, you had high emotional intelligence because your ego didn't immediately go, well, too dang bad.
Right.
And you were like, I could tailor that a little bit because I want people to be receptive to my message. So that took two high EQ people to make it happen. But we know how that could be flipped on both sides. If this person she was just super offended and she didn't say anything to you, she's just talking crap the whole time, like, look how he is, he's a misogynist or whatever. Or this, if the other person wasn't you and they were just like, well, these snowflakes just need to deal with whatever I say. You have to have a balance. Yeah,
I agree with that. And sometimes it requires, first of all, she wasn't my leader. I was several levels higher than her, but I was talking at a seminar. And secondly, I think I want to hear your thoughts on this. As a leader, you have to be able to do that woman's job. You have to be able to go down and take someone else aside and say, look, I know you don't mean anything by this, and this is coming from a good place. I just want you to be aware. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give you another example, real life example. I was at work one day at the big company, and I heard a couple of young African-American guys right out of college. In fact, they went to the same college, and in fact, they were in the same fraternity in college. These guys knew each other. And they were in their area, and they were teasing each other. And they started using some language that was okay in the frat house, okay in college, okay at home, but not okay in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And so I had to now I'm an old white guy having to take these two kids aside, and they were good. And I said, listen, sensitive subject, but you can't talk like that here because it puts everybody on edge. You just made a comment about this guy, and it was funny. You made a joke, but he used the N-word toward the other guy. Mm-hmm. Slang, clearly they're friends, frat brothers and all of that. I said, but what you did is everybody else, I don't know if you saw, everybody else sat around, and it's like, that was clearly funny as hell. Am I allowed to laugh at that? Or, oh, and they both looked at me, and these are young professionals who both, by the way, this is 20 years ago, they both have gone on, they're both executives now. Mm-hmm. And they said, I never thought about that, Mike, both collectively, I never thought about that, Mike, and they just didn't know. Mm-hmm. And I risked going in there and maybe offending them. Like, who the hell is this guy to tell me how I can talk? Racially charged topic and all of that. But I didn't want them to learn the lesson the tough way years down the line. Right. And they they would have sooner or later. That kind of talk would have. And I've had that talk with all sorts of people. It could be racial, sexual, whatever the case may be. And it's usually aimed at younger people right out of college or the military or whatever, where that kind of talk is absolutely appropriate for where you were. It's going to get you in trouble here. Eventually, someone's going to complain and they've got you dead to rights. Any thoughts on what I said?
Oh, 100%, especially, coming out of the military, and I was aircraft maintenance before. We got potty mouth for days. And, and if you go maybe to Boeing when you get out as a mechanic, you might be okay with that. You go to some corporate jet place where everything is kind of on the prim and the prime, like you can't talk like that. You have to it's all about, everything is all about a time and a place, and you have to be aware of that. And you have to be, I think, emotionally intelligent enough to realize time and place as well.
Yeah. And that, various cultures are different. And what is acceptable professional behavior in one area is just unacceptable in another. And and they both can be fine organizations. But I think what you're saying is the onus is on the individual to see what environment they're in.
Read the room.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, listen, we're about out of time here. But I can't let you out of here without asking you the fantasy question. I ask everybody this. If you were able to bring back one leader, Brittinay, from the past and spend a day with that leader, who would it be and why that person?
Margaret Thatcher for me.
Ooh.
Because I love, like, one of my favorite quotes of all time is, power is like being a lady. If you have to say you are, you aren't, which is, as you see, I love that because I can't stand when people claim something that they just are not. But I, as a woman back then, she climbed the ranks, and, I know she dealt with a ton to get there.
Yeah.
But, she had people like Ronald Reagan who really cared for her. They were on the same page. And there's just some, and I know there were negatives about her as well, but we all have that. Everyone has their downsides, but I would just love to pick her brain as to how she did it.
Yeah. I love your choice. I love Margaret Thatcher. I'm a big fan of hers. You probably noticed at one point, her and Reagan were discussing a very big world problem. And Reagan was, I don't know, Margaret. And she said, Ronnie, don't go wobbly on me now. And she said that to the president of the United States. And he said, yeah, you're right. Now, I love her. In fact, so much so that I have only a few trailers that I put in front of my podcast. And so when you hear this episode, the Margaret Thatcher trailer will be in front of it. And you're going to love the saying that she's saying. No, I love Margaret Thatcher. Proof that you don't have to be a man to be a good leader. I tell people that's all the time. And some of the best leaders I've ever seen weighed 120 pounds, be they man or woman in a wheelchair or whatever. Physical presence is good. If you're that guy that can come out with the square jaw, or that woman that just has that bearing and all that, that's good. Most don't have that. But I have seen some non-leader looking people absolutely command the room. And there was no doubt who was in charge. And I mean that in the best way. They weren't dictatorial or anything like that. They were leaders. Right. And Margaret Thatcher was it. I mean, she had a way of making her point. And I've seen it, in the House of Commons, where people used to try and lean on her, and she was very witty. And more often than not, you could see the look on the guy's face like, yeah, I shouldn't have poked Margaret Thatcher because she just made me look like a fool in front of everybody on TV. I loved her.
Yes, that's how I try to, I don't want to say I completely emulate her or anything, but they're definitely my thing is I am all about facts over feelings, even though I deal with emotions with emotional intelligence. But if you're gonna come for me, you better be prepared.
Yes.
So
yes,
how she was like that. That's the same energy I'm trying to.
Yeah, I love it. The Iron Lady and all the best ways. So great choice. Well, listen, a great podcast. I appreciate your time. I think people are going to want to reach out to you. How can someone contact you, Brittinay?
The best way is on my LinkedIn, Brittinay Lenhart, and I'm sure I'll be tagged here, so just follow that. It's the best. My website is getting updated, so the best place is my LinkedIn. It'll show you everything about me. It has a way to, get a link to get a meeting with me if that's of interest. But I'm the culture lady, so if you're ever interested, I'm here for y'all.
Yeah, well, listen, it's been a great podcast. I was thrilled when you accepted the invite. I'll let you know when this airs. It'll be in a few weeks. Great podcast. And my only request selfishly is that you consider coming back and doing it again sometime.
Yes, please.
All right. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please subscribe, rate, review, and recommend to your friends. Please visit our website at fidelisleadership.com and sign up for our leadership newsletter. Until next time, remember the words of the ancient Greek philosopher Pericles.
What you leave behind is not what is engraved in stone monuments, but is woven in the lives of others.